region, and we now work together at the Bryland Functional Medicine Centre in Christchurch and here in Timaru. And we've certainly had a crazy few 3 or 4 years, haven't we? The raise of hand, who's a little bit concerned about smart cities? Does anyone here not know what smart cities are? So everyone's probably got a pretty good grasp on what's actually happening. And when we start looking at a lot of news clips in terms of the alternative media, it's very easy to feel frightened. It's really easy to think, oh, that's just not possible. That can't happen. And a lot of these things that just seem impossible are in alignment. It appears that they could very well happen, and that's why Ross is very, and of course myself, are very motivated to try to educate, try to inform people, so that you guys as a community can be better equipped with information to do something about that. Obviously tonight there's going to be all sorts of information. Ross has done some thorough preparation to try to almost race through the first 40 minutes, which allows us plenty of time for questions and answers.
What I hope to do tonight is to put the long-term plans into context of things as far-fetched as the Smart Carbon Dioxide-Free 15-Minute Cities program and the AI World Society that many people aren't even aware of, which is based on terms like biodigital convergence, obviously involving digital IDs, which we're now watching coming through in Australia, and many things that people obviously don't necessarily know about. So I'd start off first by saying, to know that you do not know is true knowledge. Ignorance is not an insult. It simply means I don't know yet. Whatever your viewpoint is at this moment, I would ask you that, like me, you approach this meeting with an open mind and a humble heart. Our New Zealand councils are pushing long-term plans which take a 10-year outlook. Each council identifies strongly with its own plan and the billions of dollars that each council is budgeting and spends primarily to save us from climate change. Christchurch City Council is, for example, budgeting $6.5 billion over the 10 years, and like Tasman District Council, because this is happening for all our councils, their long-term plan, for example, expects a consequent rise in rates to be approximately 10 to 15% over the 10 years. In some places, I suspect this will be higher than 20%. It was not long ago that councils talked in millions. They're now talking in billions. We simply now need to pay attention. Many council staff I've spoken to at a higher level have said, if our council was being fed direction by the Smart Cities Council, I would see it coming across my desk. Where is the evidence? Simply looking at the Smart Cities Council Australia-New Zealand website, you can actually find the claim that New Zealand is the first nation in the world to have all its local councils join the Smart Cities Council. They've joined up in what we call partnership. It's claimed on the site, under the ALGIN emblem, that's the Association of Local Government Information Management, that there is an alliance bringing all 78 councils in New Zealand into into Smart Cities membership. The Smart Cities organisation, the Smart Cities Council, is a global organisation under which the Smart Cities Council Australia, New Zealand and ALGIM sit. The relationship between all our New Zealand councils and the Smart Cities Council, as I say, is deemed a partnership. Most councils aren't aware of this partnership, at least at most levels. It further states, under the partnership, the Association of Local Government Information Management and Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand will work together to provide world-leading resources to the councils, including the Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand's leading Smart Cities Academy and Smart Cities Practitioner Certificate Programme. These are all things in which people are becoming qualified. ALGIM, the Association of Local Government Information Management, has all New Zealand councils as members. So we're starting to see a spider's web, really, coming from top down, where ALGIM and the Smart Cities Council Australia and New Zealand sit directly above all our councils, feeding them information. For example, ALGIM offers free webinars to councils on telecommunications resilience, and we simply need to realise that resilience is an important word. We see smart cities resilience, we see resilience in terms of climate change. Resilience is an important term from Agenda 21 and the Agenda 2030 programme. So when we ask ourselves, well, yes, we can see this relationship between ALGIM, the Smart Cities Council, and the Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand. Is ALGIM actually parroting these words? On this level, yes, they are. The word resilience, including insights into Starlink and 5G generally. Now, this is covering the smart part of smart cities, which is 5th generation technology, ultimately 6th generation technology, which many of you may or may not know about, as we move from wearables to implantables. Presentations at ALGIM's 2024 annual conference later this year will include, and these are terms straight out of the Smart Cities Council web information, but also out of the information for our Christchurch City Council from our partnership city experts in Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain. They are including talks on thought leadership. And thought leadership is very important to understand. We are being led down a path where we engage in what's called citizen engagement. We have to learn the meaning of these terms because they're not being used for our benefit. They're being used to direct our behaviours, which are deemed to be increasingly sustainable. Sustainability was defined in Agenda 21 as the nebulous balance between social equity, environment, and ecology, as we'll find out shortly. The Smart Cities Council itself is an organisation that prides itself globally on thought leadership and engagement. Primarily, as we said, citizen engagement, getting you on board with a plan that you may not know about that's called Our Common Future. It started off with Agenda 21, which is simply the agenda for the 21st century. It finishes with the United Nations Agenda 100, which is the AI, get the correct term, the AI world society that we're moving towards. The Smart Cities Council, resilience, citizen engagement, and thought leadership are not the only terms we must find meaning for in order to better understand what's happening. For example, our media continues to push 15-minute cities and urban densification. More terms, we need to know what they mean. On the 15th of April 2024, that's last Monday, the Stuff article titled Tasman District Council Needs to Stop Buy Now, Pay Later Mentality. The article ironically vilifies those wishing to purchase a standalone home, in contrast to urban densification, on grounds that Tasman District Council's ongoing operational expenditure will be much lower if we share the pipes. The more spread out new residents are, this is the quote from the article, the more spread out the new residents are, the more pipes are needed to service their new homes and neighbourhoods. The article goes on to say, now is the time for our council to beef up investments that push more efficient, well-designed brownfield intensification of our centres, not sprawling greenfield expansions that we'll come to regret later. We're watching as our social structure is being changed, and we need to understand that we have to be able to question on the underlying assumptions that are being made. Just in case there wasn't enough smart cities language in the article, it went on to refer to sustainable transport behaviours as active and public transport, not wanting to refer to the public transport in its full smart cities speak as passive sustainable behaviour. So we have cycling and walking, which is referred to as active sustainable behaviour, and taking public transport, which is passive sustainable behaviour, and we are being guided through what's called nudge theory to behave increasingly sustainably. It's based on science that we need to start questioning, and when we do question it, we get clarity that tells us something smells funny. Now, we need to pay attention, and we need to pay attention to this language. This long-term plan for our New Zealand cities is not necessarily our future. For me, this Agenda 2050 article was finished off perfectly with this closing reference to a primary contributor called Timo Naubauer. He's a Tasman-based urban designer and small business owner. He is part of Nelson Tasman 2050. We're going to start to see these dates when we look at these things, 2030, 2050, and of course, United Nations Agenda 100, as we've just explained. So getting back to the big picture. Resilience, passive and active sustainable behaviour, and thought leadership are not the only terms we must find meaning for in order to better understand what is happening. Let's start breaking down the meaning of smart, carbon dioxide-free 15-minute cities. So smart is the biggest elephant in the room because we've watched as the base units go in, we've watched as the low Earth orbit satellite goes in with Elon Musk talking about it all the time. We've watched as lines of these satellites go across our skies, which many of us will have seen. And we've watched as the LED streetlight system comes in almost unannounced as if they were just ordinary streetlights when we start to understand how it actually works with smart modules allowing things like automatic number plate recognition and beyond. We need to start questioning what this network of frequency-based, localized, higher frequencies is going to do, among other things, to our health. It represents 5G, the biometric digitalization of New Zealand. Now that sounds quite complicated, but it simply means the real-time inventory and possible control, including rationing, of our water and energy usage and our behaviours, which must be seen to be increasingly sustainable, or at some point through what will become a digital currency, we may pay a price for not acting sustainably. In other words, not complying. And this could include further injections and much more. We're informed of the new wonderful Internet of Things that will water our plants for us when the reality of a world run by computers and AI could be very different. We are watching as smart modules on our LED streetlights begin to facilitate such things as invasive use of CCTV, ANPR as we just said, sensors on car parking spaces, rubbish bins and pavements, street activity, and this was an article on Madden Street, the smartest street in New Zealand, up in Auckland, when we were first dealing with this a couple of years ago. Street activity will increasingly be collected, analysed, interpreted and shared in real time. Digital ID and 6G are very much on our horizon. As I say, this article on Madden Street in Auckland, at one point, the smartest street in New Zealand, states that the interaction between citizens, which is obviously how we're referred to now, and technology has been studied, and that a necessary part of 5G is the LED street lighting, which is the baseline of infrastructure to deploy smart, read Internet of Things technology. Carbon dioxide free, so smart, carbon dioxide free 15-minute cities program. Obviously, we're looking at carbon dioxide free. This brings in Agenda 2050's openly stated goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. We're looking at reducing these greenhouse gases to 25% in terms of emissions by 2025, and we're not asking why, because we've been told this science is settled, and we have heard that before from Jacinda on another matter. The carbon dioxide-free agenda also heralds the planned use of carbon dioxide transaction allowances that that NatWest has piloted in the UK, and of course the CBDC that goes with our new cashless society. Central bank digital currencies could significantly change people's behaviour patterns, essentially enforcing citizen engagement or compliance through a social credit system. So smart, carbon dioxide-free, 15-minute cities. So 15-minute is a village model of living where a person's needs can be met within 15 minutes radius from their house, ideally of walking or cycling, active sustainable behaviour, or taking public transport, passive sustainable behaviour. A 15-minute city involves far more medium and high-density housing, essentially more apartments in the CBD and more multi-storey townhouses in the suburbs, less constraint on building heights and at most one car park per household in multi-household buildings, which is called urban densification or smart growth. Traffic calming measures have been hijacked. Now, I don't know if you know much about traffic calming measures, but in Christchurch, for example, most people believe that since the earthquakes, Christchurch City Council have been doing their best to basically make it easier to get across Christchurch. Clearly, this isn't the case, as most people travel by car. Agenda 2050 traffic calming measures are being intentionally used to make driving a personal car across Christchurch slow, start-stop and challenging. This is happening across the whole country. Obviously in Christchurch, with the rebuild, it's even more obvious. Traffic calming measures is a term that has been used originally to refer to any measure designed to make road use safer. Christchurch City Council have openly stated at the levels I've been talking to them at that they are using these measures to significantly reduce, significantly reduced speed limits and parking, cycle lanes, priority for public transport, cyclists and walkers at junctions, extended bus stops, speed bumps and roadworks to make driving across Christchurch as difficult and slow as possible with a view to pushing people out of personal car use by 2050. They're taking the road toll to zero because with personal cars, we won't be on the road. So, we are being herded like cattle into new programmable, sustainable behaviours, and this programming is known as nudge theory. So again, these are all terms that you can look up. The Waikato Times article of 18th April 2024, Firefighters Spark Up at Loathed Traffic Calming Measures, states traffic calming measures are delaying response times for fire crews and putting lives at risk, as this was stated by a group of frontline firefighters in Hamilton. Last month, Hamilton City Council slammed the brakes on a number of not yet contracted roading projects that would have installed more raised platforms and inlane bus stops even, across the city after a tsunami of pushback from the public. Regarding traffic calming measures already in place, the article adds speed bumps, raised safety platforms, narrowing lanes and in-lane bus stops are delaying response times to call-outs. And that was said by Fire and Emergency Station Officer Rob Hoss. They also damaged fire trucks and specialised vehicles, obviously including police, fire and ambulance. Hoss said that they try their best to avoid areas with traffic calming measures, but now it's pretty impossible. And wherever we go, we find that there is a roadworks or increasing reduced speed limits, speed bumps as you come off a roundabout. We have to travel more slowly. And in Christchurch, we actually had a road where they were trying to enforce a 10-kilometre-an-hour speed limit. Our public servants have transformed into government authorities. Now, this is actually part of the solution as much as part of the problem. As our government officials, originally public servants, have been transformed into government authorities, we simply need to transfer them back to public servants who serve us and our interests. Our government has made its UN-prompted climate change commitments, this is really important information, and has set Agenda 2030 and 2050 climate directives that are simply being mirrored in local long-term plans. Christchurch has the partnership Smart City of Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain. For people who think the Smart Cities programme isn't going on, we actually have partnership cities. And Smart Cities experts from Spain continue to provide advice to Christchurch City Council on citizen engagement and thought leadership. Remember these terms from the earlier discussion of ALGEM. This is designed to define Smart Cities cooperation, another term which has been coined. And don't think this is just New Zealand, because if you remember the reports and stuff of the people in Oxford, where you actually had barriers that were set up between villages in Oxford, the idea is the people at night in England, in Oxford, came out and they concreted in, having broken down these barricades, and literally were being vilified by these articles. The blockades at the time with stuff were referred to, again, as traffic calming measures. It's not just here. So back to definitions. Smart growth in Wikipedia, it's an urban planning and transportation theory that concentrates growth, of course read smart growth, into a compact walkable centre to avoid urban sprawl. The term urban densification can be used. And this basically... There we are, Mr. Page. We move on to sustainable development. Now, this was defined in Agenda 21, which was the agenda for the 21st century, as the nebulous balance between social equity. We'll all own the same, basically. If you look at the World Economic Forum and their phrase that many of you will have heard of, you will own nothing and be happy, which was withdrawn when people started to notice it, it's social equity. environment and ecology. It's nebulous, and we have all our big corporations coming up with really smart-sounding sustainable plans, sustainable development plans, if you want to call it that, but the reality is they're nebulous. They don't mean a great deal. Now, obviously, when we look at social equity, everyone will own the same. Environment, and obviously, in that respect, instead of social equity, we need equanimity, where we treat each other equally, but we don't necessarily own the same. If you want to work hard and get a Porsche, you're welcome. If you want to go like surfing like I do, you're welcome. Environment. Now, this includes improved urban environment, and we should be asking, improved in whose view? By the way, you could actually get a Porsche and go surfing. Ecology. Now, this is essentially wild lands, or nature uncompromised by man. Now, if you look at Hunger Games, the film, we start to see that the films are telling us a few things that might actually be going on around us. Obviously, they're symbolic, but nature to which you don't have access. Resilient cities. We've already talked of resilience, and we need to understand this is important again. The terms are being used against us. This was from a talk by Leanne Dolezal in Christchurch. Resilient cities are cities that have the ability to absorb, recover, and prepare for future shocks, economic, environmental, and social. Resilient cities, like sustainable behaviour, promote sustainable development. So again, we've already mentioned that that's a nebulous term. So we're starting to see that this whole thing goes around in circles until you start to question it. For example, in a 2023 Stuff article, Auckland was referred to as the sponge city. The rebuild post-flood is likely to involve huge green areas, wild lands, that would take the runoff in times of massive flooding and so constitute climate resilience. It all sounds wonderful, but the reality is what we've done is we've taken concepts, obviously provided to us by the United Nations, we've made assumptions which actually aren't correct, and we've come up with ideas which we defend emotionally, we've invested in them, and we defend or attack from that place of those ideas. And the reality is when we start to question our assumptions, maybe the whole house of cards falls down. A net zero social credit system. Now, this means a net zero essentially means that we are adding, or not adding, carbon dioxide, I should say. We're not adding carbon dioxide or methane to our air, and that we will pay in some way if we do. This draws into the picture the new New Zealand central bank digital currency and the imminent, almost silent introduction of a social credit system which would make us pay and could potentially ghost us from the entire system. Our sustainable behaviours are presently being guided by nudge theory. Again, once you understand what nudge theory is, it's behavioural science. You start to understand that this system could enforce our increasingly sustainable behaviours, which we could call compliance. Climate fear. Now, this isn't actually a term they use, but it's actually something that is presented not only at the level of the people, but at the level of our schools. The International Monetary Fund, on the 4th of November 22, tell us that in line with the Paris Agreement and COP27, that global warming or climate change is forecast, based on computer modelling, and I'm not quite sure where we've seen that before, Michael Baker, to cause global environmental disasters that will lead to mass migrations if we do not get emissions on track by 2030. Obviously, 2030 again, Agenda 2030, we're starting to see the picture. They add that a tipping point could be a global warming of 2 degrees, beyond which the change becomes self-perpetuating. The goal is a 25% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050, as we've already mentioned. Citizen engagement, and that's getting us on board with the plan that most of us don't know about, called Our Common Future, which we'll come to in a moment. It's basically a net zero carbon dioxide smart city where we live in villages or zones where we find it increasingly difficult to travel freely by personal car and are monitored 24/7 under 5G. So let's look at a little bit of history. So the United Nations in 1983 set up the Brundtland Commission, and the Brundtland Commission was tasked with the job of coming up with a plan. I can see a lot of yawning in the background there. Coming up with a plan in order to bring us behind something that sounds great, and it's called Our Common Future, but it took them until 1987 to change the name of the commission to that, Our Common Future. The Our Common Future Commission then came up with the action plan, the agenda for the 21st century in 1992. Agenda 21 sets clear global sustainable development goals across social, financial, and environmental areas. It introduced the term sustainable development, which all our councils are parroting without looking at the history, although some of them actually do know the history and actually agree with it, as you'll see again in a moment. And resilient cities, which are all over our long-term plans. 179 countries signed up. Agenda 21 is 300 pages long and 40 chapters. Agenda 2030 is essentially a land use plan that is strongly mirrored in our council's spatial and long-term plans. So let's just look at some fundamental ideas about the underlying assumptions we're making in accepting this program, this plan. We're looking at climate hysteria. So dubious science vilifying carbon dioxide and methane has been creating fear through computer modelling predictions where, and as I say, we've seen this before in COVID. These predictions are taught as fact in our schools. Children are marching for causes that really they're not in a position to understand. Most of us don't understand it. There is even a children's version of Agenda 21 called Rescue Mission Planet Earth. And if I just quote one line from that, of course, you imagine how you feel as a child, being born into this world. You're young, you understand that the world is seeming to be a dangerous and scarce place. You're told that it's heating up at a rate that cannot be controlled, and actually in some way you're being blamed for it. So here it actually says, the planet groans every time it registers another birth. As the Pink Floyd Another Brick in the Wall song goes, hey teacher, leave that kid alone. Some are beginning to question how children in our schools as young as 6 years old are being led to believe that they can choose their gender and identify as a furry, usually a cat. I'm actually doing a short presentation to Christchurch City Council long-term plan, and the first question was, do you identify as a male, a female, or other? So I put a male camel, and I'll be interested to see how they approach me. So for those of you who are aware of the transgender and transhumanist agendas, the latter being spelt out by voices by Elon Musk with 6G and Neuralink, and Elon easily admits that basically there are far more advanced versions of Neuralink, which is the implantables. We are presently watching as those who should now be really offended by not being referred to by their chosen pronoun are removing the right to be offended for those who should now be really offended by what is happening to our cities, schools, and people. But it's not just teachers in schools. In Canterbury, Christchurch City Council representatives are actually going into the schools to teach children about the 15-minute cities and what can be done in the face of climate change and an increasingly heating planet beyond our control to basically do anything about it. And of course, the level of hysteria based on climate fear is immeasurable in small children who don't understand the science and just believe what they're being told. The Great Reset. Many of you will have heard of this. It involves the World Economic Forum, just another of the organisations like the United Nations that we now need to distance ourselves from as our government moves away from being the authorities they've become and back to being the public servants that they should be and should have been all along. The World Economic Forum's Economic Recovery Plan is called the Great Reset. Launched in June 2020, it's not the purported knee-jerk reaction that I missed a page again. It's not the purported knee-jerk reaction that we're led to believe. With over 1,000 points per country, it was clearly many years in the making. It sets out essentially the mechanics of the fourth industrial revolution, the Internet of Things with mass surveillance, including biometrics, essentially automated recognition of individuals, typically for purposes of security. I don't know how many of you have noticed the cameras that are starting to go up in supermarkets and out on our streets based on facial recognition, which is now becoming part of our society. And obviously, with recent information about if you're a coloured person, you can actually be easily apprehended in terms of being for example, a recidivist thief. You could be confused with someone else who is the recidivist thief, and it's because AI is making mistakes, and at that level, colour seems to be an issue for it. But beyond that, we need to realise that it's actually not about looking at others and our separation, but focusing as our nature of community, which is seeing our ability to stand up against this nonsense, irrespective of our skin colour or any other separation we may choose to focus on. We need to let go of that. So essentially, it covers all areas of our lives, the Great Reset. It includes robotics and AI, which will change the way we live and work if we allow it, with the catchphrase, you will own nothing and be happy. 6G could be the ultimate tool of inventory and control. Interestingly, how did so many of our leaders become involved, including Jacinda, become involved in the Young Global Leaders Programme, which basically is run under Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum? And the answer is likely to involve implementation of Agenda 2030. In the Christchurch City Council article, Making the Shift from Climate Change, and I apologise for so many references to Christchurch City Council as opposed to Timaru. Obviously, we're from Christchurch, and I've spoken to people who are at the level of rolling this out within Christchurch. It is the same here. The reality is, obviously, with Christchurch, things are a little bit more obvious, that's all. It's the same programme. In this article by Christchurch City Council, Making the Shift from Climate Concern to Climate Action in Our City, reference is made to the Towards 2030 series, a series of Christchurch conversations exploring aspects of our climate challenges, including conversations about what is hampering climate change action and how do we grow a climate action city. When you hear growth, think urban densification. In Canterbury, the press has been a mouthpiece for Agenda 2030 and 2050. In 2018, Stuff launched Quick Save the Planet, essentially a climate change campaign, which then sprouted into the Forever Project on 25th March 2020. It states that its first issue is carbon neutral, and it's themed Life in 2030. And we're watching these dates just come up again and again, in a reference, obviously, to Agenda 2030. And now we're starting to see, maybe they've noticed this, and so we start to see dates like 2024 and 2045, but we're still actually talking about the same thing. It's very much like we started talking about 15-minute cities. People started to go, hang on a minute, what's a 15-minute city? And in many places, they started calling them 20-minute cities. Not rocket science that they're the same thing. So, in its One Hot Minute video series, it gives a platform to what's Stuff called smart thinkers, and specifies that these experts only include people with compelling ideas about what to do with a heating planet. Its climate editor states that it's our way of saying we're committed to clear-eyed, insistent coverage of the epoch-defining challenges of climate change and sustainability. A quarterly Forever Project magazine has been sent out with the press, the Dominion Post, the Waikato Times, and the Sunday Star Times, so everyone can read the propaganda. I added that last bit. On 10th April 2023, Stuff presented a video titled How Nissan is Aiming for a Sustainable Society. It states that Nissan aims to create a carbon-neutral, sustainable society in which everyone can move freely. It shows a happy group of people smiling as they're being ferried around in an electric driverless taxi. Even the big car manufacturers seem on board with getting rid of private cars and pushing the terminology of Agenda 2050, which is taking us out of personal car use by 2050. In Stuff's Forever Project article 19th April 2023, it states that climate change has been supercharging disasters like February's devastating Cyclone Gabrielle, and scientists have warned that the door is closing for more severe and deadly damage. The subtitle was a tight window to act. Again, Stuff's consistent message is urgency. Act now. There's no time to think about this. And it's a little bit like if you think about a cancer diagnosis. We want to know what's causing it. And of course, we have the capacity to critically think. And as we'll hear about in a moment, AI doesn't. And that's one of its flaws. The reality, we have the capacity to critically think. Critically thinking leads to our capacity to understand a situation, and with that insight, to make changes as a community. But we have to be willing to put in the effort, because now we are being directly threatened, as we mentioned, at the very least in our pockets, from an increase in rates that is related to massive changes in our cities across New Zealand based on climate science, which many of us know probably isn't actually really a thing. Christchurch's partnership Smart City since 2021 are Malaga and Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain. The focus for Christchurch City Council on meetings with Spanish Smart Cities experts is sustainable urban development with respect to climate resilience, as well as citizen engagement. In Vitoria-Gasteiz, nobody has a garden. Everyone lives in basically the same size apartments. You will own nothing and be happy. Every apartment has a view that includes some communal green space. There are no community gardens. There is no smart car program. Very few people have a car. There's almost nowhere to park, and you can't easily move between the 15-minute villages. The mayor has agreed to not build out, but only to build up urban densification. In Europe, the Smart City project ran to mid-2023. Its 6-year objective has been to develop the European strategy for the creation of carbon dioxide-free smart cities. It's titled The Journey Towards Smart City Carbon Dioxide Cities Across Europe. This is not happening just here, although here all our councils are implicated. I interviewed Tony Moore of Christchurch City Council, at the time Christchurch City Council Climate Resilience Lead, Principal Advisor on Sustainability to Christchurch City Council, and Science Liaison, remember this, at Landcare Research. So he must have a science background. He does actually have a relevant degree. In a moment, you'll see how bizarre his actions have been when he cannot question the science. Among other questions, I asked him, what if the climate science surrounding greenhouse gases is wrong? He replied that he is aware that many are questioning the science. He won't be doing so because if he did, he couldn't actually do his job effectively because he has to accept what the IPCC, the International Planet on Climate Change, tell him as settled science. Otherwise, he couldn't do his job effectively. To make matters more interesting, or even more bizarre, he went on to say that even if the IPCC's science were wrong, it didn't matter because what he is doing, not he personally, but what Christchurch City Council is doing, is right for the people, even if the people don't know what's right for them. We need to start asking questions. What is rolling out is the floor plan for Agenda 2050. Smart carbon dioxide-free cities across New Zealand. Our financial world is changing rapidly. The proposed central bank digital currency would facilitate total control of every unit of currency that will be tracked from creation to circulation. Who uses the funds and what the funds will, and what for, will be tracked. Funds could be made to appear or disappear at the will of bankers and technocrats. Funds could be timed out or be allocated to buy only essentials. A recent statement by the International Bank for Settlements, the BIS, alluded to 81 countries accelerating their programs for the central bank digital currency. And the banks have been preparing to accommodate this for years. Many shops either no longer accept cash and are unable to give cash back because the physical cash is no longer available to them. At the recent Sumner Surf competition called the Single Fin Mingle, which is a longboard competition, it's actually of international renown for anyone who's a surfer, but they had temporary stalls on the beachfront. Not one of them would accept cash. At some point, holding on to cash itself, because many people say, well, that's all right, I'm going to hold on to cash, whatever. At some point, this will be pointless, though, because it will no longer be acceptable currency. Even beyond the idea of fractional reserve banking, which many of you may be aware of, I won't go into that at the moment, the banks currently hold very little cash. If you wish to withdraw your own funds of a sizable amount, you actually have to pre-order, and quite often it takes a couple of days for them to get the cash in. On top of that, they'll usually ask you what the cash is for. High street banks and cash tills are being removed in preparation for a cashless society. We need to understand this is actually quite important. The new central bank digital currency is waiting in the wings. If at some point your behaviour is seen as non-compliant or overtly non-sustainable, as they prefer to call it, at least in theory, you could be ghosted from the system, essentially locked out of your world. And when you realise that this is the AI world in terms of control that they have planned, this is UN 100. And when people start to look at that with open eyes, we realise that we're just about halfway through in this programme and they are running to time. In the UK, the government's nudge unit, and this is a behavioural insights team, is working with banks like NatWest, presenting what is essentially a carbon guilt tripper. This has been going on for some time. It informs the purchaser of the carbon dioxide transaction cost for every purchase and suggests a more sustainable behaviour. So, for example, if you go and buy a pair of trousers, the carbon dioxide allowance for that pair of trousers could be quite high, but if you bought them second-hand, it would be lower, and as a result, your carbon dioxide allowance for the end of the month would be higher, and you might not just have to buy the necessities. Obviously, this is looking ahead as to how this programme could work really badly for us. First, people are being encouraged towards increasingly sustainable behaviours that one day, in the relatively near future, and I would suggest somewhere between 2030 and 2050, it may be their only choice. In New Zealand, as in the UK, our nudge unit sits under the government's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and is also termed our Behavioural Insights Team. Nudge theory was the subject of the 23rd March 2023 press article titled "Revolutionary AI is coming for a job near you. Could it be yours?" It states that ChatGPT can write letters, books, essays, training documents, and proofread and answer customer support questions. As AI learns, it says, it will make inroads into areas that humans presently occupy. It adds, AI can't do a lot of critical thinking. And as I said earlier, we can. And as a community, obviously you've got a strong community here in Timaru, the reality is you have a direct interface with council, and many of you will know people on council, and obviously we have that interface where the people who went up to Wellington at the times of the COVID period didn't have an interface with government. So you guys actually can speak directly with council. These are the people rolling things out, even though they may not see the bigger picture and not necessarily come along to the meetings. It adds, AI is swift at analysing data and patterns. It doesn't get tired or bored, doesn't need to take leave or sick days, and can work 24/7 without complaining. The article finishes with, imagine, and this is important, imagine if every touch point you have with generative AI is slowly, subtly, imperceptibly migrating you to another point of view, sometimes referred to as nudge theory. Literally, we need to know that this is about the mind. And if we believe something needs to be done, we can literally become part of the problem because we start to police each other. And this is called communitarianism. The reality is we are a community, and when we have assumptions that are not correct, when we openly discuss them without a sense of resistance, the truth tends to come out, and the nonsense, in other words, the fear, false evidence appearing real, seems to disappear in this light of awareness. The reality is, in communitarianism, I got reported to the police for talking to people about the abuse to children of wearing masks. I actually had police who don't come out to a burglary, came out to interview me over talking to people. And the policeman in charge, he basically, because of two of them, obviously not a busy day, and the guy in charge basically said, I'm actually really interested to know about the science behind this. So I explained it to him. He said, I agree with absolutely everything you've said, but it's an inflammatory subject. We cannot afford to be inflamed because we value our viewpoints over truth if we're inflamed. We're holding on to our assumptions. And the reality is, none of our assumptions are actually correct. I don't know what I'm going to learn next about anything. And as a result, I actually know nothing for sure. In that space, I'm open to new information. And with humility, why wouldn't we have that discussion? In the New Zealand Herald article of 20th February 23, Convenient Street Planning or Open-Air Police State, Wild 15-Minute City Conspiracy Explodes. It's actually a propaganda article, believe it or not. It tells how blockade bollards, which we were talking about earlier, erected between villages in the city of Oxford, had been removed at night by local residents. And I mentioned this earlier, but it does bring back home the fact that this isn't just happening here. The article referred to the blockades, as I mentioned, as traffic calming measures, and we're watching those measures increasingly become influential on our lives. In a Warwickshire scheme in England, participants could win prizes for tracking their active, remember, walking, taking public transport, going for a run, taking a skateboard, which I still ride a skateboard, by the way. Basically, they're tracking their own active and passive sustainable behaviours, taking public transport across the country, essentially using the carrot instead of the stick to achieve desired behavioural change, which I would call compliance. In the World Economic Forum article, My Carbon, An Approach for Inclusive and Sustainable Cities, they state that COVID-19 was a test of social responsibility and that we need to monitor our own carbon levels. And as I just explained to you, the CBDC, with its carbon dioxide allowances, could be doing that for us shortly. Obviously, in the meantime, we're being convinced it's actually a good idea that we should monitor our carbon allowances. Agenda 2030 calls for monitoring and control of all water. This is really important as we start to see the full impact of a possible Three Waters programme across New Zealand. We basically are looking at fluoride in all our water, chlorine, and a lot more that could be a major problem for our health as time goes on, let alone the loss of control of water, which could lead to rationing of water at some stage. Water is a God-given right, and we have great water in New Zealand if we just had an infrastructure that would support it. It's, according to this, to be managed as a finite economic resource, to reflect the true value of water resources. And it's the Three Waters component under the 5G inventory and control system whose infrastructure is now in place. Skylink above us, base units in every single suburb of our cities and towns, LED streetlights surrounding us. ICLEI, I-C-L-E-I, the Local Governments for Sustainability Organisation, is a global network of more than 2,500 local and regional governments committed to sustainable urban development. They run a well monitoring programme already operating in Australia. Now, if they come to test your water here, which hasn't happened yet, the reality is we could be policed out of utilising our own drinking water from our own wells. And this does seem to be on the cards. Bankers and big business seem to have colluded in a concerted effort to restructuring our societal, financial and political worlds. Under Jacinda, who signed us up to the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially a new Silk Road for the trade that will take place under a one world government, moving the power base from America with the petrochemical dollar across to China, our position needs to be recognised as being in the South Pacific region within this programme. It also relates to the signing of the TPPA. So in examining our current local situations, we must not ignore the world map and where we sit. It's not just a local situation based on our councils. We need to see the bigger picture. Agenda 2030 is built on the foundational concepts and consequent assumption we make if we cannot question the climate change science presented by the IPCC. Is ultimately herding us into villages that now sound a little familiar as we pass through areas like Christchurch's Linwood Village. I don't know if people come up to Christchurch, but if you drive through Linwood Village, you'll start to see this. Agenda 2030, now this is basically not the long-term plan, but Agenda 2030 envisages ground floor retail built out to the edge of the pathway. 1, 2, 3 or more levels of residential apartments above and round the back an alley where there is space for at most 1 car per household. Out front there's a bike lane on each side of the street, regular speed bumps, a low speed limit, an extended bus stop, often on one side and then on the other side of the same short street, so further reducing parking. And it's likely to have only 1 lane for cars with limited passing spaces. And all of this, once you get onto the street, is termed traffic calming measures, designed to make it pretty difficult for us to say, actually, I'm not going to take that cheap bus, I'm going to take my car somewhere. The International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, ICLEI, as I just mentioned, that was set up in 1990 with the sole purpose of implementing Agenda 21 worldwide, which obviously was 2 years later, started off in 1992. It puts out a local Agenda 21 planning guide on grounds of environmental concern, and you can remember that from Christchurch City Council, focusing on turning environmental concern into environmental action. And this includes focus on anti-sprawl and smart growth. Some may ask, what if the carbon footprint that they're trying to get rid of is you? Our government, which seems to have successfully transitioned from public servants to government authority, is approaching Agenda 2030 as an unavoidable necessity. The agenda has the backing of both National and Labour, it's been reported. The reason given for this is that proposed changes will endure between government and so secure our increasingly sustainable behaviour long term. Now, if you're finding this a bit long, we've only got a few moments to go, so keep the energy levels up. A Stuff article even attempted a spin on proposed events whereby Labour and National, now painted as heroic, was sticking it to the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard people, who quite rightly would actually be complaining about the higher density housing being built in their neighbourhood. And they've been painted as undeserving, while putting on an equally bizarre spin on pushing urban densification with the seemingly positive imagery of creating a right to build medium-density housing, even though it's clearly against the wishes of the people living in that locality. The last Stuff article I will mention was printed on the 25th of June 2023 and is titled From NIMBYs, not in my backyard people, to Legal Beagles. These are the characters at public meetings. So they're talking about you now. It aimed to stereotype, ridicule and marginalise those who are taking the time to attend public meetings, to find out more, and to have their voice heard. There was no focus on why public meetings were being held. Instead, the focus was on convincing the reader that attempting to attend public meetings was a waste of time. I would suggest that now is the time for transparency from councils and government. To gain community insight, we must be able to question anything, and we need an interface to be able to do it. We need open discussion. Just because we may feel individually that we have nothing to say does not negate our standing up for our right to free speech. Freedom is not something to be earned in the future, but instead is the right to do what is right today. A laissez-faire approach, let's wait and see what happens, and I've come across this in many people. They say, well, I'll just wait and see what happens. Will not work. It's like the ostrich putting the head in the ground. Each time the head comes up, are things looking better? No. We each must now play our part and have that heroic conversation. For many, it will simply start by asking someone sitting near you at a coffee table, and I do talk to everyone, what do you think of our council's long-term plan? And most of the time, the answer will come, what long-term plan? The light of community insight, which is what we're seeking, will dissolve the compartmentalized intelligent stupidity that ridicules critical thinking while ignoring vital, increasingly obvious, provable facts. Equally, this is not about blame, very important point, and solutions are not about punishment. People have made mistakes, and as I said at the start, ignorance, simply not knowing yet, is not an insult. Prevention is always better than cure. We must never again give our power away to those who do not fully represent the interests of our community. And obviously, as we move away from the idea of public servants to the idea of public authorities, with no real point at which it happened, the reality is we now need to move back, but much more quickly. We need to cut ourselves off from the World Economic Forum as a country. We need to cut ourselves off from the United Nations. We need to cut ourselves off from so many organisations that literally are pushing through this agenda, including the Smart Cities Council and at the parts that ALGIM and the Smart Cities Council Australia and New Zealand have played. And we need to wake the councils up to what's actually being rolled out and why this ridiculous amount of money that's being made out to pay will not only push our rates up, but bankrupt our councils. The problem of UN-fed communitarianism that is being presented to us in the fluffy language of Agenda 21 in form of smart carbon dioxide-free 15-minute cities. Community must stand up and say aloud no. A new model designed for the people, possibly also built around villages, will at some stage emerge. Biometric digitalisation under 5G's Internet of Things, whereby a real-time inventoried and controlled, increasingly gender-confused transhuman population with no access to community gardens, obviously I'm making it sound a little bit intense, but really it could be, helps build their own prison with walls is not our future. We need equanimity. We need to value each member of the community equally, but not social equity, where we all own the same limited amount. And this also brings in the idea of a universal wage. We are not needing this universal wage because we don't need the problems that are being imposed on us. Final line. As community rises, the unit price of freedom drops because it is the informed community now standing up and no longer just individuals. All we need is an open mind and a humble heart. Thank you. Well, the reality is in New Zealand we still can go out, but aside from that discussion, the reality is we have a toxic environment and we're spraying all our food. We need to change what we're doing in New Zealand. We need to pull ourselves away from these organisations that allow us to eat toxic food, to drink toxic water, which literally we're now in the process of doing through Three Waters. So if you're looking at urban densification as the issue, we are following the process of urban densification based on the Smart Cities programme, which is Agenda 2030. And when you talk to people like Tony Moore, they fully admit this. It's a United Nations agenda run from the top down, which makes some sense in places where you do have a very high population living in a small area to a point. But if you do it for the wrong reasons, you will end up, in my view, in significant trouble with an inventory and control system that literally will change the way our society functions. So it's like cycleways. Cycleways are a great idea, but if they're basically utilised in order to take us out of cars based on science that hasn't been questioned and in many respects doesn't make sense. And this goes through lithium batteries and all sorts of reasons why it doesn't make sense, aside from the fact that we live in an area where we do have earthquakes, and if you basically try and get out of town in a car that can go 150 kilometres and no further, it's not a good look. That this was presented to Congress in regards to those. But sticking to your question, which is urban densification, we need to look at the reasons we're doing it. And at the moment, the reasons we're doing it don't make sense. They're not scientific. They literally...
We can't expand our cities outwards.
Well, who says we can't?
What can we do?
Well, exactly. The point is, we're not saying we can't expand them outwards. And the reality is...
More important, that arable land around our cities is a hell of a lot more important than houses.
My understanding is that we actually can feed ourselves. We easily can feed ourselves as a nation based on the land that we actually have access to now, and that the option for building out is still there in huge areas around New Zealand itself. Our focus has to be on looking at the underlying assumptions that are being made in terms of what we're now doing, which includes urban densification. So without looking at that, we might find another way. It might involve urban densification. And as one of the things I actually said during this talk is that we may find that we move to a village-oriented spatial and long-term plan, but not for the same reason. So once we start questioning our assumptions, we can then look at whether we need urban densification or not. But if we're still focused on the same system, we're actually doing lots of questioning of things that at the moment may make no sense whatsoever, because we haven't questioned our assumptions. And without those, we accept the ideas, and we just end up discussing those ideas. But we haven't questioned the assumptions, so urban densification could be a good idea in some respects. We're bringing people off the land so that it can recover. But the reality is we have to question those assumptions before we look at the plan. So absolutely. Yeah. So the ideas can sound wonderful. So Our Common Future sounds wonderful. It's a lovely title. But the reality of Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2050 is based on Agenda 2030, obviously, and both of them actually, referring to greenhouse gases that literally may not be a problem. And of course, when you question sea level rise, you start to come across a lot of evidence that points both ways. A lot of scientists are, as Tony Moore, himself a scientist, he said, I recognise many scientists are actually questioning this, but we're told you have to act now. You have to follow the agenda that's being followed across the world and started off in the 1980s with this agenda. So the reality is, if we can question our assumptions, then we can start to relook at the plans. But until we do, we're just arguing over the details of a plan that is based on assumptions that probably aren't true at all. Yeah, and this is actually a big issue. Sorry, I was going to repeat the questions, wasn't I? This is actually a big part of the question. We're given options. So I'm being asked literally, what options should we be asking for if we can ask for options, because often we're dictated those options, and that's basically how our political system works. You can have the blue or the red. Which do you want? They're both controlled fundamentally by the same people. They both want the same agenda. But which one would you like, the red one or the blue one? And of course, the reality is we need a government that basically are public servants. We need to wake up as a community, and our conscious action, which is compassion, courageous action, starts by changing the only person you can change. Guess who that is? It is. But the reality is when you change yourself, you start to experience a world beyond the imagination of the person you used to be. And of course, this moves beyond what we're talking about, but it recognizes that we don't have to accept this. And if we believe we do, we're probably right. And if we believe we don't, we're probably right. You're absolutely great in the fact that you've said we don't really have options. We're being told you have basically a long-term plan. It's coming in. It's going to cost between 10 and 15, maybe 20% rise in your rates over the next 10 years. It's based on science that you may not agree with. Let's talk about how we're doing it, not let's talk about whether we're doing it. So that's the option. We need. Yeah, I've interviewed people from environment. I get my knowledge and information primarily from talking to the people rolling these things out. I don't get on the internet very often, and so the reality is most of these people believe in what they're doing. And they're not bad people. Tony Moore's a very nice man. I interviewed him in his garden, for example, and he talked about how he walks to work down tree-lined streets, 15 minutes, of course, 15-minute city. And I said, but you've got a beautiful garden. And in the model that you're actually looking at Vitoria-Gasteiz, which is your ideal, no one has a garden. Yeah, it basically, he sees it as a way forward. So really, in terms of what we're looking at, if you look at Agenda 100, the idea is we're moving towards a biodigital convergence in what they call an AI world society, literally where we interface directly with the internet, and if we don't follow our sustainable behaviours, we basically pay a price. Ultimately, we could be ghosted from our world. We would engage in what they call a metaverse, which literally, if we contribute to the metaverse, it broadens, and we supposedly excel, and if we don't, again, we can be ghosted from the system. So I totally understand your question about the densification, but if you look at the detail without examining the assumptions, yes, maybe there isn't enough land to build out, and we start to need to contemplate building up. I don't believe we're in that situation in New Zealand, and I believe farming can actually be done where we still rotate crops, where we don't spray everything with chemicals, we don't have plant regulators, which are far worse than many of the other chemicals that we may be aware of. We don't use glyphosate, for example, chelator of nutrient, antibiotic, endocrine disruptor. We need to start looking at toxicity, and toxicity comes in form of electromagnetic, it comes in form of chemical, and it comes in form of emotional. And we're watching as our children, as I mentioned, convinced that they can choose their gender at 6 years of age, that they can pretend to be a furry. It's nonsense. And once you start to question some of the foundations, of course, the pile of cards on top doesn't last for long. So I believe that when I talk to people, I hardly come across a person who doesn't realise we're in dire straits, not the band. And these people basically want to do something about it, but it's not yet affecting them directly. Now, obviously, in the next 10 years, with the rates alone going up, it's hitting us in the pocket. And if we don't agree that climate change is actually a problem, we are going to possibly be losing our house based on science that we don't agree with. At what point are we willing to stand up and take that courageous action? And this is where I'm saying, the only person you can change is yourself, but most of us try to spend our lives trying to change someone else or others. The reality is what's my courageous action? Who do I need to talk to? I've gone undercover several times. I've done things that basically looking for information, talking to people, pretending to be someone else, for example. The only way you can get that information. But the reality is that when we do these things, we find out that maybe these things shouldn't be happening. And many people are involved in things which don't benefit the community. Ultimately, as we start to recognize that in aligning with a loving intelligence, we have the capacity to reduce suffering with each of our actions as opposed to increase suffering. And obviously, if we accept urban densification, and I'm not picking on you, but if we accept urban densification as the only way forward, the fact is there may be things that we're not yet aware of that would mean we don't have to have that urban densification. So I'm not saying urban densification is a bad thing, but under Agenda 2030, in my understanding, it's not going to benefit the community.
Which has got good leadership.
Well, because this is being rolled out through the councils, the wonderful thing is we just have to access the councils. And of course, I recently was giving a talk to the spatial plan panel, and I said before, and they're all sitting around in front of their computers, it's all being televised only for Christchurch City Council. And I said, look, the first thing I need to know before I give this short talk is, are the decision makers here? Because otherwise I'm really sort of wasting my time, unless I'm potentially just raising someone's awareness that at a later date it will make a difference. And so the lady who was running the committee, the panel, she basically stood up and she said, well, what we do is we collate the information that you bring to us, we give our own opinion to add to the information that you've given us, we send the information across to a partnership Māori panel, Māori partnership group they called it, and they don't have to take our advice. So, yes, but well, this is where we, I'm assuming he's not here because I don't know his face, but we invited the mayor along tonight. At some point, you get someone who knows people in a position of power where they can exert a level of influence that means that council says, actually, no. And this is happening across New Zealand as a whole. A lot's happening overseas that you wouldn't necessarily be aware of. It's not reported in our papers. Huge pushback from the farmers in many areas of the world relating to the changes in farming, including America, believe it or not. You'd have to look for it, but there is a lot happening. There are pictures that reflect this. Sorry, over the top there. Well, I don't want to bring spraying missions into tonight. I've personally interviewed the US flight crew that are involved in it, but that's a matter that's probably a little bit beyond tonight's area. But it is going on, and that's another thing. Well, the digital currency itself basically is your only connection with government-approved food. So essentially, you're talking about the end of the century, essentially, or somewhere between 2050 and the end of the century. The idea is if you sit outside the system, you basically lose the right to money. And without money, you can't buy. There's no physical money, it's all digital. And so that's the nature of the system. It's a control and inventory system. It basically inventories you in real time, everything you do, and it's based on the direct interface with the internet. So
I was wondering what countries aren't included in this. What countries?
I couldn't tell you. I know there's huge pushback in certain places. Venezuela's has had some very interesting things. South America as a whole, there's been some very interesting pushbacks. I don't know how successful they're being. At the moment, we have the last country for regime change under the Project for the New American Century, which is Iran. We're watching an international situation unveil Taiwan, again, a very important country in terms of what's going on. 1948 in China, basically, the Chinese were convinced that Japan was such a big threat that they accepted communism. And basically, the idea was that Taiwan's never been communist. And of course, we've watched as Hong Kong's been drawn back into China. And of course, with many events that have been going on in the recent past in Taiwan, we're looking at front lines around the world, like Haiti as well. A lot going on that many people aren't aware of. But it's just sticking to the Smart Cities program and the long-term plan. We need to put the long-term plan in context of a bigger picture. And when it's hitting us personally in the pockets at 10 to 20% increase in our rates over the next 10 years, this alone could bring the people together.
25%.
Well, many councils are spending billions instead of millions. As I say, I can't see rates going down in terms of covering that. So funding is a big thing. And when you actually look at the long-term plans, as you were saying earlier, it's not actually about should we do this or shouldn't we do this. It's this is what the budget is. What do you think? How are we going to do it? And I think that's a very important place for us to come from, is that we're actually looking at that bigger picture. I don't have all the solutions, because the solutions come when community arrives. The results actually come with community action. It's literally compassion and kindness. We're not actually fighting this system. We're literally shining a light on it, and these shadows disappear. The reality is we don't have to engage with the World Economic Forum. We don't have to accept the agreements that have been made in our name by people who don't represent us. Well, we are repeating history on one level, but one of the areas, I speak to all sorts of people, and obviously the retired population who are actually quite comfortable generally are looking at their next holiday, they're looking at what they're doing at the weekend, they're looking at the next kitchen, and they're not wanting to be involved. They're too near the end of their life as far as they're concerned, even though they might have another 20 years, and the reality is they don't care. Now, so the reality is what point do we care? And individually, that's up to us. If we don't care enough, we become, I suppose, detached. And when we let go of our attachment to a particular outcome as how we would like it, but we're doing what's right now. Of course, we're fairly secure of achieving what we, reducing suffering, which is the goal. Obviously, as I mentioned, if we accept the overall plan and we start focusing on things like urban densification, or, and again, I'm not picking on you, or any element of this, yes, urban densification itself could actually be a good thing. We're drawing people into a place where they can live in communities, where there are villages. It sounds wonderful, but the reality is if it's done for the wrong reasons, we could end up in an AI-run prison. So that's fundamentally.
At what point did we lose the difference between AI, artificial intelligence, which we're holding supposedly is quite high in our future, to AI, actual intelligence that we have, and makes us far superior to any artificial construct that can be created? I mean, they're developing a digital system which you flip the switch and it goes away. Its one weakness is it has to be powered by electricity in some form, whether it's batteries or solar or whatever. But
Well,
it's dependent on those that are dependent on the internet, dependent on the power, dependent on everything working together, and they're all vulnerable as heck.
No, there's a new supercomputer that's being brought in 2028 that basically is beyond all that. It literally, you can't shut it down. And that's basically called Starlink. And that's basically what we're watching when we watch, and again, this is all brought to us in films, of course. What's the film I'm thinking of with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Terminator, yeah. So literally, Skynet, yeah. And Skynet's actually the military name of Skylink. So go figure. But Starlink is obviously the new computer system that's coming in. It's a quantum computer that starts off, I'm calling it Starlink. Stargate, sorry. It's literally a quantum computer that basically runs from 2028 and is designed to police us. So it doesn't have to happen, but the reality is we have to start somewhere. So obviously, I'm building a bigger picture. We need to look at the long-term plan. And this can be stopped at council level.
No, you don't. So it's literally impossible to have a proper smart city without the 5G network system. So what
Yep.
wattage out of this grinder would you need to
Well, William's made a very important point, and the question actually related to what do we need to take away that will basically prevent us being controlled and inventory on a real-time basis, and the answer quickly comes back 5G. We have the base units in place, we have the LED streetlights with the smart modules that basically, as I say, automatic number plate recognition, everything else. If you go into a bay, for example, in Cornwall at the moment, in England, you go into the bay, you've got 10 minutes to park, at which point you are deemed to have parked. If you don't pay for your parking in that bay, you look around, you think, oh, it's a nice bay, but I'm not going to stay. But you take longer than 10 minutes to get out, you are deemed to have parked. You are then sent, because you've registered your car, a bill for parking. If you don't pay that, and you're sent a higher bill than you would have paid because you didn't pay. And if you refuse to pay, you're then sent a recovery bill. So you can end up with about £250 simply for entering into a bay, not parking, and leaving. And this is automatic number plate recognition, which is run through most of these commercially oriented holiday bays. And this is where we're moving. So you'll have, as I mentioned, transmitters and receivers on parking spots. There was recently actually quite a comical situation where someone signed up for an app, or not just one person, that basically related to parking in Christchurch. And they were sent a ticket because they left a minute and a half or something after the time that they were there. They were actually policing themselves by signing up for the app, whereas the traffic warden would never have caught them. So the reality is we need to let go of the policing system, and the only thing that we need to get rid of is 5G. So you're absolutely right. And I'm not suggesting you do this, as a population, as a community, if we bring the towers down, and there have been many attempts. There's people within the industry there's one chap who did admittedly lose his job over this, but he took a bulldozer and he took out 4 towers in Australia. So yeah. So the reality is they'll keep putting them back up and you'll get a criminal record. That's not going to help anyone. But as a community, once we decide we don't need this inventory and control system. We don't need the World Health Organization. We don't need the United Nations. We don't need the World Economic Forum's influence. We need a government that represents our interests. We need a government that serves the public rather than is an authority. And we need to look at the underlying assumptions that have been made in Agenda 2030, which actually is Agenda 2050, which actually is our common future, which actually is not our common future. So hopefully not too much information tonight from my side. It depends on the smart module. So the smart modules are an integral part of the LED streetlights. The little things on top are photon transducers, which are supposedly only involved in turning the light on or off depending on the available light, which of course is nonsense because you'd want to turn the grid off at the same time because it's the time that Christchurch lights up or doesn't. The reality is it has a dual use, and it's part, in my understanding, of the smart module. Once the smart module's active, then it's facilitates the excessive use, as I mentioned, of CCTV, monitoring, facial recognition, ANPR, automatic number plate recognition, and a whole load of other things. So the idea is we don't know what they're doing with these units at the moment, and there's so much we can't know, but the reality is fear is simply false evidence appearing real, and we can identify a heck of a lot of things that aren't true, that we're being told. And the actions that are presently being taken by our councils involve in a huge amount of money, measured now in billions, as we said. And if we allow this to go ahead without standing up and saying, hang on a minute, let's just look at your assumptions before we move ahead. Why is every single council doing this, as an example? And most councils will say, well, I don't think there is an arrangement. But then the Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand website says there is. We need to start having the people who are rolling this out in possession of some of this information. And of course, most of them are actually good people who want their families not to live in a digital prison. So it's exciting, I promise you. The reality is we're watching. I'll give you an example. The idea is if you have something that on the face of it seems to be bad, you don't know where it's leading. And often it's the best thing that happened to you in retrospect. But there was never a need to change until you had that obstacle. Now, the scale of this obstacle is actually the scale of the opportunity. So the nature of our transforming community is immense. And of course, it comes from a place of loving intelligence where we care about each other and we care about where this is going, rather than, as we said earlier, the past controlling the present and how we feel. So, yeah. As a person, we're a bundle of memories. We project desire and fear over this moment, and we miss the power of now. Right here and now, we can actually do what feels right. It comes from the gut feeling as opposed to the brain. The brain tells us what rationally we should do, but it's always involving self-concern. Once we start to let go of that, we shine our light more brightly, and in that light, people start to wake up. And it's, as I said at the end, as community rises, the unit price of freedom drops, because it is the informed community now standing up, and no longer just individuals. So as an individual, it takes a certain something to stand up and for example, I went surfing during the pandemic, and I got reported by all sorts of people. I had the police on the beach waiting for me to come in, which I didn't. It's just realizing when you look at something that doesn't make sense, a child choosing their gender at 6 years old, pretending to be a furry, we're allowing the nonsense at the moment. And the reality is we can all stand up and do this. And of course, as more of us do it, it becomes easier to stand alongside. And that's where community suddenly appears. And I have people from Selwyn Council, as an example, coming to me and saying, look, we can't say this in our meetings, but can you go and talk to Christchurch City Council about this? And so it's raising awareness in people that at some stage, who knows what will make the difference. But if we're all doing this, yeah, I mean, you may find that a few of you get together and basically say, look, Mayor or whoever you're talking to, can we arrange a meeting? Because I think you were saying that I was invited to speak to the Chamber of Commerce. Council, sorry. And the reality is we just get these opportunities, they just appear, and it's what I would call synchronicity as opposed to coincidence, which is simply synchronicity unrecognized. And the reality is when you start to find these things move forward quite quickly. And basically, the world changes in ways you couldn't imagine as the person you used to be. In practice, it's still there, but and the reality, of course, when you look at the science, it's very important to understand why we shouldn't have it. But obviously, fluoride has many reasons why you wouldn't want fluoride in your water. I can explain them, but we won't do that now. I actually gave a presentation to the DHB while the DHBs in Christchurch were partly responsible for the fluoride situation. And basically, I came out of the meeting, and they'd been fairly uninterested, to say the least. And a secretary followed me out, and she said, I'm glad I've caught you while you're shuffling your papers. She said, they agree with everything you've said, but they can't be seen to do so. So this is where we are in a situation where the people supposedly representing us have to sit on their hands. Tony Moore of Christchurch City Council said that I'm the only person who's ever questioned him on his belief system in terms of rolling out what's actually happening in Christchurch. So traffic calming measures are a big one. Any of these things can make a difference. And once we have that interface between council and people, as you say, it's that sense of numbers. And then people who are now affected by the pocket, with the increase in rates, what are we paying for? Do we agree with this? It's big. And we have this going on around all over the country. And this is another place where you might start to find with great people like this offering their premises for this open discussion, that the open discussion at some point, even in each individual meeting, can lead to a place where we interface directly with council and suddenly the difference is made. It's the courageous action, which is compassion. And compassion simply reduces suffering. It's loving action. And anything that's not loving increases suffering. And where we look at a system that would imprison us in a digital converged place, not so good. So what I would say to that, I had a fairly deep discussion with a fairly high military guy the other day who's basically sending people to front lines around the world. We didn't mention Ukraine once. As you say, there's a lot to know. The reality that we're experiencing is that you cannot ever expect someone else to do it for you. You cannot change the world unless you let go of who you used to be, who wouldn't have changed the world. You can't look at a seeming obstacle and not find out that it was the opportunity. And of course, if you do nothing, you'll repeat history. And that's what we're watching. We have the capacity to change things, but the only person we can change is ourselves. Sorry.
So,
It hasn't happened, but yep.
well, they did campaign on it, so we're hopefully going to hold them to account for
Yeah.
that. But New Zealand did vote for cash.
Well, the questions come in terms of can we vote our way out of this, basically. And the reality is in the early 1960s, New Zealand borrowed a huge amount of money. And this money was partly used for hydroelectric power, many other things that the country couldn't afford. I was interviewing, again, I find my information from the people at the front line. This particular chap was a very high-level veal farmer, and his personal friend was very high up in Freemasonry within New Zealand and in the New Zealand government. He borrowed he basically said to his friend, how, with about 3.5 million of us, no worries, how, with only about 3.5 million of us in this country, can we afford this amount of money that we've borrowed? And the answer wouldn't come for many years, but eventually he reneged and he told his friend that we've had to agree to take the refugees when they come. It's about migration. This has been agreed a very long time ago by people who control the governments, no matter who gets in. So it's the illusion of the blue and the red, and I can see people starting to feel that they need to leave, which is important time for me to say thank you very much for coming along. Hopefully I've told you a couple of things that might lead you to do a little bit of research that you hadn't done yet, and I appreciate that certain things are neither right nor wrong on their own, but it's the underlying reasons that they're being done that we need to look at, which is where the urban densification comes in. I agree, neither good nor bad on its own.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
And I guess one of the key things we need to do is we keep needing to talk to everyone, and we need to keep this information alive. We need to share this sort of information. That's why we're recording this. And so if you take one of Ross's flyers, and it's also supporting good causes as well. Like we've got radio reality check. Oh, I got that around the wrong way. That's it. Thank you very much. And also, we donate a lot of our time to make films for Counterspin Media. They're actually really good at interviewing. Has anyone seen the 12-hour Truth-a-thon? Absolutely mind-blowing, unbelievable interviews. In the 12, so it's counterspinmedia.com, and look, and they're just releasing the segments now.
One of those videos actually has information about the AI World Society, which relates to UN 100, which I think many of you might not know about, even though you're well informed, and that's worth seeing.
It's like, oh my God, and this is legit information. I think that particular one, the lady's called ZZEEE Media, I think. Yep. So, Counterspin Media, they by the way, they lived with us for 6 months in Christchurch. In fact, you know how they got arrested? Guess whose clinic they raided? So the police come in, broke all of my cameras, and actually they're really good people, and they do a lot of good cause, and they're running on the smell of an oily rag at the moment. So obviously we don't profit from anything. We donate all our time and our efforts towards making quality content. And I don't know, everyone know Philip Tomlinson? So we're making a lot more videos, by the way. Philip pulled the Pfizer study to bits. Did anyone see that video? So he pulled the Pfizer study to bits and proved 600 deaths within 24 hours. And so that's on Counterspin Media. Again, if you email us, we can send you all these links. Come up, Solomon. Yeah, Solomon's a really good bloke, does huge amounts for the community. Unbelievable. He's also running the South Island Independent something or other. Give a bit of a spiel about yourself while you're here.
I wasn't meaning to gate crash, I'm sorry. So I'm Solomon. I own the South Zealandia game gift shop, lolly shop, cafe on 82 Stafford Street in Timaru. So I've been doing that for a while, but Sunday nights tend to be our quietest night, and I'm just like, look, there's so much happening in the community. There's not enough people, getting up and doing stuff, and it's great. I come and talk to loads of people, and it's not much good if everybody's talking to me and I'm talking to people. I'm like, we need to get more people talking to each other in the one place, and that's something that I really, really want to get going. Now, like I said, the place I'm in is still quite small, but it is what it is. But from July, I have a massive venue, and if we can, get people in the community talking to the community, because like what you guys were saying is dead right, is the community has to take responsibility for looking after the community again, and that has to start somewhere. And it'd be sad, I personally find it sad if you guys all get together, you hear this amazing information, and then, we just dissipate into the ether. If we can start coming together again and actually start doing this and bring community back into community, we might actually have a shot at all this, so.
And it's just interface with council, so literally, they're just people.
Yeah, so. We're currently at 82 Stafford Street, but we're going to 47 Stafford Street. So we're still on the south end of Stafford Street. If you guys know where the new Animates is, I'm right next to KM Electrical. It used to be the vacuum cleaner shop next to us, so that's where we are now. The building I'm going into is the old secretary service building, which is next to the audio electrician near the vegetarian cafe. But that's where we're going into. I've got the keys now, but doing a lot of work. But early July is when I'll be opening that up. But if people want to come by The only day I'm closed is Tuesday, but I'm open all day and into the evening the rest of the week. So if anybody wants to come down and chat, see if we can organise something locally, like, I think something needs to happen because it's getting bloody serious. So, but.
Oh, there is a
Do
time.
you need any volunteers, to help? You do a lot of you do a lot for youth. I don't even think you get funding for all this sort of stuff.
No, I don't get any funding for any of it. I do it all off my own back and whatever I can do. But like Sunday afternoons, we do like a free community lunch out of my shop. I've got a couple of people that chip into that, but basically I don't like asking people for help, but if people want to come down and help, and even if it's just having a chat, like the more, like I said, if the community starts engaging with the community, like this will just happen.
Community simply means with unity. That's all it means. And with unity is breaking down those barriers that exist between us based on ideas that we defend or attack from. So we can discuss anything without getting angry. Unlike many people who feel a sense of resistance when a certain subject is mentioned. So when that breaking of barriers comes down, council are going to listen. So literally talk to each other, talk to others, and suddenly that community, which you may not feel is there, is you actually it's been there all along.